Yeah, and this actually sort of loops to a kind of an interesting balance that we have to strike that always emerges in these conversations. So one part, one tendency, which in a funny way can apply from everything to Syriza to I think even some of the kind of frankly apologetics around China are just it's all contextual. What could you possibly do inside the political environment as it's given, and therefore every single either capitulation or even sort of generation of a governing model that we wouldn't even aspire to has to be explained in those kind of defensive terms. And then of course the other extreme is just the classic, it's like everybody, anytime I do some content on Brazil or something, there's always the person that pops up to remind me that, Lula was a neoliberal, whatever that even means, just these kind of, that everything is a question of willpower. Allende could have resisted the CIA and Pinochet if he only sort of, wanted it more. It's this kind of weird, kind of left mix of this kind of incredible fantasy idealism, but actually also very like almost kind of like power of magical thinking, almost like if you just wanted it more, it would happen, and the kind of ideals could transcend material circumstances. And so what is the middle position here? How do we actually track this out so that we all of a sudden don't go from understanding that Syriza was really pressed, they didn't have a proper strategy, there wasn't much room they had. And then on the other hand, it is really true that Syriza, by the end of their tenure, was more aggressively implementing austerity than, some of its sort of mainstream political competitors.
Well, you're always, when you're engaged in left-wing politics, you're always picking up some of what's left around you. Like this is the truth, because we don't set the terrain. But I think in the past decade, what we can see is that we did too little to try to at least shape that terrain around the electoral struggles. So the move towards elections and away from the extreme marginality that the far left was in at the start of this decade was really valuable. And we should be, we shouldn't be delusional about that. We went from a period where, our ideas were in rooms of 10 and 20 and 30 people with barely any engagement amongst the class with a mass audience, to one where millions of people were engaging with our ideas, saw our movements as to some degree representing their aspirations as working class people, and were prepared to throw their lot in with us to some degree, whether it was, total loyalty or involvement or whatever. It was at least to support the policies and the programs and so forth that were being put forward by the left. So this was, in many ways, this last decade, there are things for us to take from it. But equally, we've got to see where mistakes were made. And again, I think it's worth comparing different kind of projects here. So we talk about, Syriza as a new left formation and whatever. Well, another of the formations that came up with the silver bullet answer for the left in the last decade was Podemos. And Podemos were the kind of big thing for a period of time. And I have great respect for an awful lot of people who were involved in it, because in many ways it was an innovative project. And some of the things that Podemos did, I think, are worth learning from. But the ideological basis of Podemos was a populism that oriented away from class politics. So what Podemos were willing to accept or pick up from the terrain that was lying around was the idea that fundamentally politics was no longer about class, that it was something that at a discursive level, that all political questions were being formed up above by a mediatic sphere, and that there was no underlying class tensions in society that were, the fundamental structural influences. And on the one hand, Podemos produced these great innovations. They talked about La Casta, they talked about the regime. They produced these terms that were popularized. They were not Marxist terms, but they were Marxish terms, right? To talk about politics that were popularized in Spanish society, and that then, gave them an audience and a space that was much greater than the left had had before. But you saw the real limitations in their political strategy, because unless you have an understanding of capitalism and class that is quite deep, you'll always end up in the tactics and never in the strategy. You'll always end up making these kind of small maneuvers from on top. So I do think that actually the last half of this decade, the Corbyn and Sanders experiments were the ones that we take most from, because in many ways they were the return to some of the older questions of the left, the older positions, not only in terms of, running within the Labour Party or the Democratic Party or whatever, but actually in terms of trying to build off the basis of older school left-wing social democratic ideas with the centrality of class politics, and with an idea that you did need this broader context. Obviously, Bernie talked about the political revolution, but he was also quite clear about unions, and Corbyn obviously was integrally involved with left-wing trade unions. Now, both of those projects, what they did in a very important way was they had a class politics, but they had a mass orientation. So they were trying to take the left away from thinking and talking about the left and towards thinking and talking about, society as a whole, and engaging in politics in a way that would be relevant to people's day-to-day lives. And both of them failed ultimately in those tasks, in part because even though the turn towards elections is right and is good and something we have to be, we can't now discard that and say, oh, that whole experience was a failure. No, we still need people in the institutions. But one thing we've definitely learned is that it is not possible to shortcut this. This attempt to kind of reverse engineer socialism by getting people elected who would just shoot up through the ranks, win an election, and then all of a sudden be able to do it all from above was never going to happen. The truth of it was, we found out, when you're talking about the media, this is one great example. We didn't build our own left media institutions. We didn't get our people into the media institutions, and therefore the media could destroy us. We didn't do the work of producing more effective socialist institutions and organizations on our own terms, and therefore the existing parties, the Labour Party, the Democratic Party, could destroy us. We didn't do the work of rebuilding the trade union movements in a way that made them a force in society that could reshape the political terrain and put things a little bit more in our favor, and therefore capital was able to shape things in a way that eventually broke and destroyed our projects. So I think what we can say is that you have to pick up some of what's lying around if you're trying to build a political project. There's no point, as you say, in engaging in total voluntarism, thinking just by your force of your will you can create a political project that doesn't relate to the world. No, you've got to pick up some of what's there, but you've also got to try and shape the terrain. That elections by themselves are not going to produce the silver bullet solution, but that mass orientation that elections force on you, the discipline of having to put your ideas and your program before the people and have it tested in front of the people, is something the left cannot afford to discard. Because I think when you look at the demoralization around now, you can easily see how everyone would respond to the kind of siren song of people on the left who are saying, well, let's go back to just talking to the left. Let's go back to just those small rooms that we were in a few years ago, the comfort zone. We can't allow ourselves to do that, because we'll be setting ourselves back years and not a decade.
You just watched a Michael Brooks show video. Subscribe to get them all. Why wouldn't you? Don't be foolish. Click subscribe below and become a patron as well. Patreon.com/TMBS. Thanks, everybody.